Hi, this is Peter Kelly-Detwiler. I'm a storyteller and author talking about global decarbonization and the energy transition. And today on our show, we're going to talk about how you create an adaptive organization in the face of a climate-constrained world and a changing climate. We're also going to talk about how you talk about climate with an audience, half of whom doesn't even believe the story you're telling them. And then we're going to dig into some of the lies and truths about batteries, electric vehicles, the power grid, and recycling. So we hope you'll come and join us for what should be a very interesting conversation.
Congratulations! You are tuned into Dov Baron's Leadership and Loyalty Show, the #1 podcast for Fortune 500 executives and those who are dedicated to creating a quantum leap in leadership. Your host, Dov Baron. He's an executive mentor to leaders like you. Dov Baron is an international business speaker who was named by Inc. magazine as one of the top 100 leadership speakers to hire. Now, over to Dov Baron.
Welcome, dear friends, fans, and fellow aficionados of leadership excellence. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Dov Baron's Leadership and Loyalty podcast. I'm your host, Dov Baron. I'm here to assist you tapping into the one thing in your business that changes everything by transforming meaning into action. On that subject, I have a special announcement for you. My brand new course has just been released. It's titled Creating a Culture of Belonging. It's available on Coursify X. And the course is separated out into 8 sections. It's going to take you by the hand and walk you through exactly what you need to do to create a culture of belonging, because creating a culture of belonging maximizes your personal and corporate success. Get ready to strap on the tanks and dive deep into what it takes to create a culture of belonging in your organization. Curious to know more? Simply go to coursifyx.com/belonging. That's coursifyx.com/belonging. All right, on today's show, as a leader, you've no doubt had points where you've had to throw yourself into learning something you didn't know, but you needed to know. So you can imagine the level of expertise that you would develop if you spent 3+ hours a day pursuing 30+ newsletter feeds full of information about what the technology, the politics, the economics, or the implications of whatever it is that subject was. Now imagine doing just that, for a subject that you would likely become one of the most debated subjects there is. Anyone who has been in a leadership position knows that in leadership today, you've got to know things that you probably never had to know a generation ago. It just is the way it is. And one of those subjects is that you may never have even imagined you might need to know, is that about global energy transitions, how that's changing, what it might mean to the global economy, and therefore to your business and profitability. Well, for the next 2 episodes, that's what we're going to be discussing. And we're going to discuss it with, if not certainly one of the most knowledgeable and research-driven individuals in the world today. More on that in a moment with our guest, Peter Kelly-Detwiler. Now, before we dive in, as always, we need your help in staying relevant. So please get over to wherever you tune into podcasts from. Do us a favor, rate, review, and subscribe to the show. It makes an enormous difference. We love reading your reviews. They really help. And when you subscribe, it lets others know too. If you are a regular listener, big thank you to you for making us the #1 podcast globally for Fortune 500 listeners. And we are honored and grateful to be cited by Inc.com as the #1 podcast to make you a better leader. All right, let's dive in. There's a lot of talk about changing economics of the world. They're moving away from fossil fuels to electric cars and electric everything. There's some very confusing conversations about things like carbon neutrality and net zero emissions, and what can and will that all mean to business and to your personal freedoms. Our guest today for the next 2 episodes is Peter Kelly-Detwiler. Peter Kelly-Detwiler has over 30 years of experience in the electric energy industry, with much of his career spent in competitive power markets. Formerly, he was a senior vice president leading Constellation Energy Demand's response team. Peter admits to being an having an abiding obsession, which is to understand whether or not humanity will collectively rise to the challenge of changing climate. He spends 2 to 3 hours a day pursuing 32 newsletter feeds full of information about technology, politics, and economics, and the global energy transition, trying to get a grasp on what's happening and why, translating that into actionable information for his various clients. Peter Kelly-Detwiler says that at the heart of the conversation is one simple fact. Atmospheric chemistry doesn't give a damn about your politics or your preferences. It doesn't care if you're a Republican or if you are a Democrat or whether you're poor or you're rich. He says we had better understand those dynamics and how to work our way around this conundrum as fast as we possibly can. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and help me to welcome leading expert and the author of The Energy Switch, Mr. Peter Kelly-Detwiler.
Thank you.
The crowd goes wild, young man.
Thank you, Joe. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm really looking forward to our convo, mate. I loved our last conversation because there's so much more to Peter than the world knows, and we hopefully will get a chance to touch in on, I don't know, German literature, hitchhiking across Africa, and God knows what else. Fascinating guy. So listen up, because he's got his finger on the pulse, and there's a lot to learn here. But before we get into all of that, I always like to start with, what is the origin story of what gives your life meaning? Because, we end up on these paths, pursuing careers and doing different things and learning certain things, and and we don't often trace it back to say, well, where did all that start? What is the origin story of what gives my life meaning that may actually have nothing to do with what you're doing?
Yeah, the origin story is fascinating. I mean, I try and think about that. I can tell you one thing. From a very young age, I was obsessed with what justice was. What was it? How should one person treat their fellow human beings? And it's funny because a couple of years ago, my wife ran into someone who told me that this woman that she met was like 6 on a school bus, and I think I was 8, and someone was picking on her, and I protected her. She remembered it. Like years later, I actually donated $1,000 to a charity that I was trying to raise money for, so cha-ching, it paid off, right? But I've always made it. Yeah, it's weird how those things cycle back. You never know what the unintended consequences are of your actions, good or bad. But that was kind of cool when the butterfly wings flapped for a long time before that wind came back to me. Then when I was in college, people will remind me now that I was an angry man because you could see if you wanted to, and even if you didn't want to, that the environment around us was already under a tremendous amount of stress, and populations were growing, and already there was a whole lot of environmental damage occurring, and all you had to do was see it and extrapolate forward and go, okay, this is going to be a problem. So my wife reminds me that even when I was working in Africa and economic development, every time I'd open up The Economist, I'd immediately go to anything having to do with environmental issues. So it was kind of foreordained that eventually I would get there, because ultimately we're all stuck on this little blue marble, and how we treat the planet is a reflection of not only how we treat each other, but also some of our spirituality. Well, a lot of our spirituality, right? We are all, whether we want to or not, whether we admit it all or not, we all breathe the same atoms of air that have been breathed by dinosaurs and every creature before us. We drink the same water. We are all inextricably connected. And so I guess that's been my driving force. And now these days, I think about, some people say you should live your life for your obituary. I can imagine that at someday, many of us are going to be on that gurney being wheeled down the hall with the tubes in our noses. And to me, there's one essential question that you got to ask yourself, which is, did what I do have meaning? And if that were a biography, would anybody even bother to pick it up and read it?
Yeah.
Right? If you don't have an interesting story to tell, some people say the unexamined life is not worth living. I say the unlived life is not worth examining.
That's an interesting flip. That's really good. Thank you. That's very insightful. One of the things you mentioned certainly with the girl on the school bus, was these unintended consequences. And so if I'm writing your origin story, it's called the unintended consequences, because the work you're doing right now around climate and energy, etc., is about unintended consequences. And that lady who remembers being on a bus while this young kid stood up for her, had some sense of justice, was an unintended consequences. And I think that unintended consequences are neutral, meaning that they might be negative, they might be positive, but there's always going to be them. There are always ripples on the pond. And whether you stick around long enough to see them doesn't really matter. They are going to happen. And you maybe need to decide, these are the ripples that I want to hit the shore, right? Or is this the one I'm going to go, ooh, that's not so great. And I think it's a very, very interesting point. Now, I mentioned in the opening that you formerly were the senior vice president for a Fortune 125 energy company. What was the turning point in your life, in your leadership, in your business philosophy? Because you seem to be in a different place with how you're approaching that now. Maybe I'm wrong.
Well, so I started off in energy working, came back from Africa. My wife had a difficult pregnancy. We both did, but more for her than for me, right? That brought us back from working overseas. And then I got into energy because a friend was in it. But very quickly, I found my way to a job where I was working for the Grand Council of the Crees in northern Quebec, and they were fighting a large hydro project that was going to be built on their land without their say-so. And they were going to export the hydroelectricity to the northeastern states. And so the person I worked with was an expert. He could model the reservoirs. He knew power backwards and forwards and sideways, but he hated to write. Just hated it. And so he would research all night, and then I would come in like at the right hand of Buddha or something, and he would kind of vomit all the thoughts in his head in a somewhat organized way, right? And then I would just sit there and write in shorthand and try and turn all this raw intelligence, and he was a genius, into something that was comprehensible. So that's how I kind of learned energy. Well, after 5 years, we won all our cases for not only that Aboriginal group, but the Ontario Crees, the Manitoba Crees, the Anishinaabe Nations fighting a pipeline in Ontario. And so my wife said to me one day, well, what's next? We're going to win all these cases. Where's our economic lifeline? Time to move. So she goes, well, what about we move to Latin America? I said, well, okay, I'm fluent in German. That's not going to help me that much in Latin America, except maybe
Argentina.
Yeah, exactly. Well, a week after that, and this is this sort of, you put yourself out to the universe, nothing ever happens if you don't imagine it or have the conversation first. You have to, the soil needs to be prepared for the seeds, right? Mm-hmm. So a week later, I get a call from a consultant I'd worked with. Now I'm down in Santiago looking for a program manager. And he basically said, would you like to take a 2/3 cut in pay and come down here and work with me in Santiago, work on it?
That sounds exciting.
Who could say no to that? So I asked my wife, I said, here's something really stupid. We got a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old, and rent's not cheap down there. What do you think? And she said, let's do it. I mean, my wife is one of these people, put a spoke in the wheel of the bicycle and see what happens sometimes, right? Just because, because it's different, because we can learn. So we ended up going down there for 2 years. The kids went to Montessori. My wife ended up years later becoming an assistant head of a Montessori school. One of my sons now lives in Buenos Aires. And so that all changed our life in a whole lot of ways. And we came back. I got into competitive power markets. And ultimately, by now, when I was in Chile, they had a competitive power market. And what I was trying to do down there was figure out how could you integrate efficiency and use market mechanisms to make the market cleaner. So now the U.S. opens up and I think, okay, maybe I can bring that intelligence to this market. Well, it took a long time because first of all, we had to get the billing right and everything else. It took years. But the demand response thing, now I got in that direction because there was a short period of time where I was unemployed within the company, but I'd been there 10 years, Dov, so no one was going to fire me. And every day I'd go into the office and I was researching what was Swiss Re and Munich Re and Lloyd's of London, all the reinsurance companies. This is 2006. Mm-hmm. What were they saying about climate change? I was trying to get a deal with GE to buy 30 megawatts of panels that we could actually put onto our customers' facilities and integrate that into our retail power contracts, because that production of power would be during the most expensive hours of the day back then. I was trying to get wind turbine on a large industrial facility in Rhode Island behind the meter with them. So the company started to say, oh, you're the mad scientist. Could you help us start demand response, which is essentially paying people not to use electricity during periods of peak demand? So you'd have to build new power plants. It'd be like here where I live, getting to Cape Cod on the weekends is a fool's errand.
Yep.
But what if you paid a whole bunch of people to get on the road before 7 a.m. and get over the bridge? So you took less stress off the system later. You wouldn't have to build that third lane because it would be virtual. So that's what we did. We built virtual capacity in the grid. And that gave me a keen understanding for the first time of the relationship between the customer and technologies on that side of the meter with wholesale markets and the power that could be brought to bear to create a cleaner and more efficient grid. So then in 2012, then we got bought. 2012, I get a year's worth of severance if I care to leave. And so I did. And that year I wrote for Forbes and I got to interview all the CEOs. And that was my inflection point, because every CEO of the battery companies had 5 people and, maybe the dog under the owner's desk and more ideas than anything else in capital. The CEOs of, Sunrun, the largest residential solar installer, she wanted her business model to see, publication light of the day. So I was able to start to interview the CEOs of all these companies before they had even sort of climbed out of the crib. And that gave me this initial viewpoint for how this entire ecosystem was likely to unfold. And what I found was, if I stayed ahead of and kept on asking the what if questions, what if you put the peanut butter and the jelly together? What could that create? What if you put solar and batteries together? What if electric vehicles could actually export power to the grid? What if you combine these resources in different ways? Could we create something better, cleaner, more economically efficient, and overall more elegant than what we have today? So that was kind of how I came to it all.
So that's a very interesting journey for sure. When I think about that, and I think about all, the fact that you spend, 2 or 3 hours a day pursuing these newsletter feeds, gathering all the information, as I said, about the technology, the politics, the economics of the global energy transition. What's the 10,000-foot view today of that? Because, obviously, I want to get into some of the nitty-gritty of it. So the 10,000-foot view, because when I look at it, and you and I have talked about this before in a previous conversation, there is some very black and white conversations going on that seem, in their own ways, to have great validity, right? So you're on this objective stance of like, well, here's the research, here's all the information I've gathered, and I get, so what's the 10,000-foot view? And as a sort of sidebar to that question is, we know this, and I just took another subject just to take the pressure off for a minute. Let's take about pharmacology. We now know that much of the pharmaceutical research is paid for by the pharmaceutical companies with a pharmaceutical bias. And there's the same argument about energy. Sure. Right? So as you're doing all this research, that bias, from the other side of saying this is all bullshit, is saying, well, you're reading stuff that's bias in it because it's paid for in this way. So I know that's a complex way of asking you the question of the 10,000-foot view.
Yeah. Okay. So the first premise you start with is that when you open the conversation with atmospheric chemistry doesn't give a damn.
Right.
So we were at 310 parts per million in 1957, during the International Geophysical Year, when the Soviets and the US and Europe got together and said, we're living on this little blue sphere hurtling through space. Let's figure out what we're doing to it. So they put the observatory on Mauna Loa. and measured, among other things, CO2, and it's 310 parts per million. Now we're 100 parts per million more than that, and we're about 1.2 degrees centigrade warm. The existential imperative here is pretty simple. I was at a conference in Chicago, and Dr. Don Wibler, who was one of the chief contributors to the national climate assessment that was presented to the Trump administration, said, hey, here we are in Chicago. And you get up in the morning and you go outside, and then 3 hours later, there's a much bigger delta than 6 degrees centigrade, which is like 9 degrees Fahrenheit, something like that. So what's the big deal? And he said, so let's do a thought experiment. Instead of heating the planet, let's cool it down 6 degrees centigrade. And he goes, we're sitting here in Chicago. Where would we be if this temperature on the planet now, and here where we are, we're 6 degrees centigrade cooler? Everyone looked at each other like the dopes that we were, and he said, we'd be under about a mile of ice in the middle of the Laurentian Ice Age. That's how much a degree matters. So, first of all, big picture, it's a problem we have to solve. Second one is, there's a whole bunch of pieces. There is no magic bullet. There's like a magic machine gun, maybe, but all the bullets that get spit out of it are going to look different.
Yeah.
So, for example, carbon capture and storage, renewables, maybe modular nuclear reactors, maybe some more geothermal, certainly a lot more energy efficiency. Doing more with less is always the biggest bang for the buck. More participation of end users on the grid. I mean, this is your classic stew with all the elements that have to go into it. And we can't afford to bring a lot of ideological biases to the door. What would be great is if we taxed the damage, if we said carbon dioxide costs us this much, give or take, to society, and we'll let markets organize around that. If you want to be more polluting, you pay more, and those monies are used for something else, like a classic cap and trade. Politically, that's not feasible because a lot of people don't want to see change. They'd rather see us all, I don't know, do what, but they're not willing to change. And so you get the tools that are dealt with you, but one of my frustrations right now is we cannot allow the perfect to be the enemy of the good. We have to try a lot of different things and see which ones take root, which ones get to scale, and which ones don't. And so that requires having an open mind and constantly reappraising and going, you know what, I thought I knew, and now I'm wrong. And so I'm always asking people, challenge my assumption on this, because here are the facts as I see them, but maybe I'm missing something. And every once in a while, I realize, I thought I knew this. Usually it's not a major fact, but it could be an important piece. And I go, ooh, I thought I knew that, but now I realize I didn't, but now I think I do. So that constant curiosity and open mind, my frustration is when I see somebody say something like this. There was a 5 megawatt solar array that was smashed by a whole bunch of hail in someplace out in the Midwest. And they're saying, see, solar doesn't work. Now, 5 megawatts, there are over 100,000 megawatts of solar in the country. So they basically extrapolated from one tiny event and said, see, this doesn't work. And intellectual laziness is my bugaboo. When I hear people say that, oh man, it's like the red flag in front of the bull. I just want to charge because it's not helpful to the conversation. It's misleading and it's intellectually dishonest. And that's, I would say, back to this whole justice thing, I cannot stand intentional dishonesty. It just makes me see red.
I can certainly understand that. And at the same time, we talked about this in a previous conversation, but the number one thing human beings dislike is being wrong. We're not keen on being wrong about anything.
Right.
I don't care how enlightened one might be. They're still like, there's all this talk in leadership about, embrace failure. Yeah. Piss off. Nobody enjoys that. Yes, we do have to do that, but it's not something you can tell people because they're going to resist that. And it's the same with being wrong. So the people build these camps in things, and you and I talked about curiosity in our previous conversation, and we're both driven by curiosity. But if you nail down your camp and say, this is the truth, and I'm staying in no matter what, then there's no room to adapt, and that's part of the challenge. So part of what I think happens is the ignorance of language, or the changing of language. You and I talked about this in a previous conversation, this idea of I'm with these people and you're with those, and this means this, and therefore it doesn't mean that. So one of the things I would like to ask you, because you're right in the meat of it, help us to understand this distinction between net zero emissions and carbon neutrality. Those are two things that seem to get thrown together.
Yeah.
And when you're on the wrong side of that argument, it can feel like everybody wants to take my freedom away.
Yeah.
So help us understand that.
Okay, so carbon neutral means basically you're responsible for as much as you're emitting. Actually, net zero, you can actually go below your emissions. But here's the thing, though. That's kind of parsing something that's kind of like the last mile, when really the problem is to solve the first 90% of the problem. I hear selling to sustainability professionals use those terms interchangeably. And yeah, there's some nuance between the two. And if you deal with science-based, the SBTI emissions, for example, and Carbon Disclosure Project, they'll say you got to be net zero and not carbon neutral. But it's kind of a nuanced thing that, to me, is kind of like arguing about that angels harmony dancing on the head of the pin. Let's talk about the pin for a minute. Right. And let's literally put a pin in this and say the real critical thing right now isn't that last nuanced piece. It's getting going. It is starting somewhere on your decarbonization journey. And what I know to be a fact is the things I knew 12 years ago when I started trying to develop this big picture, they keep evolving. Every time we open the toolbox, the tools get different. They generally get cheaper because of economies of scale, Wright's law. Every time you double global output, costs fall by roughly 20 to 25%, that experience curve. And then, you solve this problem and a new one reveals itself. It's like walking through a haunted house, only sometimes a better experience than that, sometimes worse. And so I think getting, like people who talk about how do we decarbonize the grid, I don't really care about that. My question is, how do we decarbonize the first 30 or 40 or 50%? And then, yes, it's good to have a longer-term roadmap, but we all know that everything we think we know in terms of scenarios and outcomes is never right. So you can overplan that trip from here to California, and you're going to get the flat tire, the unexpected bathroom break, the blah, blah, blah. Like, just figure out the first steps on the journey, and then figure out how do you create, back to your issue of culture, how do you create a culture that is resilient, that is adaptive, that is learning, that is mutually reinforcing? The things we are trying to solve, we will solve them a lot better if we have smarter, more adaptive cultures and recognize the need for those changes. And if we're also really careful about the narrative and how we tell ourselves. The stories we tell ourselves become our realities. That's part of the problem in this country is you've got half the country being told a different story than the other half, and we don't want to listen to the other story because we think it's BS or it threatens us somehow, right? Yep. So we're stuck in stories that don't serve us that well. So I think really, this is a long-winded answer to your question, but I sometimes get a little worried. We get too focused on these nuances about if we were going to take an analogy in baseball, was that a slider or a curve? Well, who cares? He threw it and the batter missed it, and that was strike 3 and the game was over.
Right. So just again, to boil it down to what you just said, which is, you got to start somewhere. Mm-hmm. Right? And so, we're a leadership-focused show with people involved in the space of leadership. What is the start space for us in the leadership space, for us who might be, in the executive suite or senior management of a company or founders, what is the first step? While we're busy arguing over what net zero is, where do we start?
Okay, so let us start by assuming that a corporation is an amoral entity. It is not immoral. Its job is simply to make profits for its shareholders and to be involved in some kind of economic exchange where there's a buyer and a seller, both willing participants that mutually create value.
Yes.
Okay? All right. So now you're in this business, and the first thing you do is know, okay, we're moving into an increasingly carbon-constrained world where the rules are changing because they have to. So the very first question any intelligent leader asks himself is, how is my business likely to be affected by this? It's why Larry Fink, who's the CEO of BlackRock, winning $10 trillion, sent that letter out a couple of years ago to to the CEOs of all the companies he owned and saying, you need to understand and report to us your exposure to carbon and climate change. And he says, it ain't woke capitalism, it's capitalism, right? So the first thing you do is you understand what your exposure is. Is it supply chain? Is it shipping? Is it, if you're making shoes, is it the hydrocarbons in the shoes? What is it? If it's, you're manufacturing beverages, well, is it the recycling at the end of it? Where are you most exposed? And not just to cost, but customer perception as well, because those will become costs or benefits. And what's your social license to operate? And so, in fact, I'll go off on a little bit of a tangent, but in the energy space, Elon Musk is a somewhat polarizing character. Somebody I highly respect on an email thread the other day, who owns a Tesla, said he saw 4 other non-Tesla vehicles, and he asked each one of the drivers last week, why not a Tesla? Why'd you buy this VW ID4? Why'd you buy this Polestar? Every one of them said, that man.
Yes.
And so, that's how brand matters, right? Yes, that's very successful now, but there's a lot of people who are green who will not step into one of those cars.
Right.
So back to the original question then, where do you fit in that carbon constrained world, which is going to be increasingly carbon constrained? And where does that affect you in terms of your future profitability? How does it affect you in terms of the teams you need to build, the skill sets you need to develop? And so I do a lot of keynotes. I'm doing one in a couple of weeks for an association of cooperative utilities and talking about these issues. And then how do you have to become adaptive organizations? And part of it is linear planning doesn't work anymore. You have to go scenario planning. It's like The Art of the Long View by Peter Schwartz, where, he basically, Shell Oil, and they were looking around the world decades ago saying, where could massive supplies threaten our investments in the offshore oil platforms? And they looked all around the world and settled up. There's the Soviet Union. There's the guy with the strawberry birthmark on his forehead. If he comes to power, the liberalizing forces that bring him will also likely open up those oil markets to the world. And so they started watching his political fortunes and changing their activities accordingly. So that scenario planning, understanding where your vulnerabilities are and your sensitivities, and figuring out then, how do you organize the team? What investments do you make in hiring and talent, culture building, and then also the hard assets? All those are critical parts of adaptive strategy.
Fascinating. We're already at the end of part 1 of the show. It flies. This is truly a fascinating conversation, and I want to certainly dig more into that. Talking about the power grids, talk about recycling, talk about all those kinds of things. I said, where do we start as a company? But we also need to look at where do you start as an individual, because we're all living in the same world. No matter, as you said, it doesn't matter what your political side is, you're still going to have to breathe the same air as everybody else, unless you're maybe Larry Fink and you bought your own atmospheric bubble. But otherwise, we're all going to have to do that. So I want to talk more about that when we come back in part 2. Peter, would you please tell everybody where they can find out more about you, about your resources, and of course about the book?
Sure. The quickest way to reach me is on LinkedIn. I'm the only Peter Kelly-Detwiler in the world because I married my wife. It was a merger, not an acquisition. And so, reach out to me on LinkedIn. And then if you send me your email, I will share with you my reading list if you want it. And I also have a weekly video of the top 5 to 10 energy stories from around the world. So that's the place to start.
Fantastic. And of course, the book is available on Amazon and everywhere else. And of course, we'll make sure all of those things are posted in the show notes so you won't miss any of it. It'll be right there for you. Peter, again, fascinating conversation, mate. I'm looking forward to part 2 of the conversation. For you, dear listener, stay curious, because we're just one click away from part 2 of this conversation. We're going to dive into certainly some of the opposite arguments around energy and what it is and what we need to be concerned with. And we're going to take a deeper dive with Peter into looking at personal responsibility. Do you need to have it? And what will it mean to you if we don't do it? So stay curious, my friends. Stay curious. We're going to be back in just one click with Peter Kelly-Detwiler.